So, we're going to begin today with Russia Moves South. Dominic will go first and give us a broad overview of this topic of Russia Moves South. Then Tom de Waal will go forth and talk about his expertise in the North and South Caucasus, the relationship of Russia and the Soviet Union. And then Valentina will finish with Russians in Constantinople, the emigration after the Bolsheviks. And if there's time, I'll say a few words about anything they've left out. All right, let's begin, Dominic.
Thank you, Ron. Yes, I went to sleep finally at 4 this morning. At 5 o'clock, I was assassinated by a socialist revolutionary in a nightmare. So I'm feeling a bit fragile. Okay. Russia moves out. I won't talk for more than 15 or the absolute maximum 20 minutes, but 15, God willing. Look, the logic of Russia moving south is extremely obvious. The Muscovite state, the heartland of the present Russian state, in the medieval era, is way to the north in an extremely infertile agricultural zone. What gives that zone some element of viability are its rivers. The main rivers flow south, some west as well, but the ones which flow south, above all the Volga, into the Caspian, the Don into the Black Sea, and some others eventually into the Black Sea, the Dnieper, obviously, once the Russians moved west. There is an absolutely clear common sense logic in moving south. You move out of the extremely infertile agricultural zone around Moscow into the much more fertile lands, the Black Sea soils of the steppe, and you move down the rivers in order to control the riverheads, because if you don't control the riverheads into the Caspian and the Black Sea, your trade is interdicted or at least taxed by rivals. So the logic is absolutely clear. The obstacles are also extremely clear. They are the steppe nomads above all else. Remember what I said, from about 1000 BC to 1500 AD, or CE as we call it now, 2,500 years, in military terms, nomads usually are much more powerful than sedentary societies. The great Eurasian steppe, all the way from Hungary to Manchuria, is the home par excellence of the nomad. I could go into why the nomadic polities are militarily more formidable. It is partly that every male from the age of 12 is a warrior in arms.
And the females, isn't it?
The females can sometimes fight, but they can totally look after the herds and everything else at home. So you're mobilizing an enormous percentage of your population for war. They're trained in the saddle and for the use of the most formidable weapon in the pre-modern world, which is the composite bow. So they have mobility, they have firepower, they have training, etc., etc. It is extremely difficult for sedentary societies to stand up to them. The nomads knock out, for instance, the Sung and the Ming empires. You know, they knock out great Chinese imperial systems, which are infinitely more powerful and more sophisticated than the Russian principalities. So you've got an impossible obstacle for century after century to expansion southwards. The era of nomadic superiority comes to an end roughly around 1500, 1600 AD. And the Russians move south. And the reasons why sedentary societies such as Russia win over the nomads in the next 200 years are global, not just Russian. They're to do with all sorts of things, you know, population, the evolution of the modern firepower army, all sorts of things. You know, so you can make obvious comparisons with European expansion outside Europe. You know, the comparisons with the French conquest of Algeria, for instance. You can make even more obvious comparisons with the fact that the Chinese state, the Qing, end the 2 millennia-old challenge on the northern frontier in the mid-18th century. And it is the 18th century as well, where Russia finally totally triumphs over the nomads, colonizes the rich grasslands to the south, controls the outlets to the Caspian and Black Sea. The specific Russian challenge in terms of moving southwards into the steppe by the 17th and 18th centuries, or 16th, 17th, and 18th, is above all the Crimean Khanate. the Khanate of the Girais, which is basically a slave-raiding polity in many ways. It's both its wealth and its political economy, the ability of the Khans to actually control the Khanate, is based above all on massive slave raiding into Russia. The slave markets in the Crimea are enormously profitable. For instance, the first sugar plantations in the world are on Cyprus and are largely worked on by Slav, Russian and Ukrainian, to use an anachronistic term, labor netted by Tatar slave raids, etc. Now, the rulers, the Crimean Khanate is an indirectly ruled part of the Ottoman Empire. The Girais, the rulers of the Khanate, are the second family of the Ottoman Empire. If, as very nearly happened twice, the Ottoman dynasty had died out, the probability is that the Girais would have become Ottoman sultans. So what the Russians face is the Crimean Khanate with the Ottomans behind it. If you look at the situation in 1500 or 1600, the Ottoman Empire is far more powerful than Russia. By 1800, that is completely reversed, and Russian power is much greater than the Ottomans. The decisive wars which create this situation are Catherine II's victories over the Ottoman Empire in 1768 to 1774 and 1788 to 1792. It is those wars, for instance, which conquer most of the areas which are now in dispute between Russia and Ukraine. New Russia, in inverted commas. It is no coincidence whatsoever that sometimes when you see Vladimir Putin making his speeches about the war to the Russian population, he has a bust of Catherine II behind him. If you want to look at the results of the war, what they do is totally eliminate the nomadic threat, the slave raiding threat from the Crimean Tartars, thereby enabling the colonization of the immensely fertile lands of New Russia, which then are hugely and very intelligently colonized by the Russian state and become within 30 years the core of Russia's export agriculture, and within 60 or 70 years also the core of Russia's metallurgical coal and iron industries, the absolute sinews of Russian power. Within a short, 1774, Crimea becomes, in theory, independent, in fact, a Russian protectorate. It's annexed in 1783. Within 10 years, Potemkin, above all, has created the great naval base in Sevastopol, all the infrastructure to sustain it, the colonization which is behind the infrastructure, and Russia dominates the Black Sea. This is a total revolution. This idea that Potemkin villages, really is one of the crassest generalizations. The Russian colonization and creation of this infrastructure for power after the defeat of the Ottomans is an extremely remarkable achievement, and one for which Potemkin and Catherine, of course, more than anyone else is responsible. Russia established throughout the Ukrainian steppe on the Black Sea coast, that is the basis, the essential geopolitical, logistical, demographic, and military basis for its expansion and conquest of the Caucasus, and above all of the Transcaucasus, and also for its movement subsequently into the Balkans. So that's one side of it. From the Ottoman side, and power is always relative. From the Ottoman side, firstly, of course, the enormous growth in Russian power as a result of the colonization and its establishment on the Black Sea coast is a complete disaster in itself. Totally swings the balance of power against the Ottomans. But on top of that, for 300 years, the Black Sea had been an Ottoman lake. It was the key to the internal communications, in many ways, of the Ottoman Empire, and it was a huge strategic asset for which the Ottomans really no longer had to pay almost any price. Once the Russians are on the Black Sea, your internal communications, your crucial geopolitical theatre, suddenly becomes immensely threatening and immensely expensive to defend. On top of that, the costs of the war are catastrophic in financial terms for the Ottomans. The war indemnity makes things even worse. And worst of all, in many ways, is a combination of military defeat, bankruptcy, absolutely undermines the Ottoman central government's attempts to claw back power from regional power holders, and it becomes a spiral downwards. I could talk for a long time about why the Ottomans lose, but I won't. You're welcome to ask if you want. Perhaps I just say two things. Firstly, geopolitics. What you have to remember is that both Russia both on Russia's eastern frontier and the Ottomans' eastern frontier, you had the Mongol Empire. When the Mongol Empire collapses in the 14th, 15th centuries, a huge geopolitical space opens up to Russia's east. It doesn't face serious military competition or security threat until the 1890s and the rise of Japan. From the immense areas conquered come the furs, the silver, the gold, of course, the agricultural territory, which make an enormous contribution to Russian power in the Tsarist era. Remember even that the center of the Russian military industry in the 18th and the first half of the 19th century is the Urals, conquered territory in the post-Mongol geopolitical space. Compare that to the Ottomans. Far from a space opening up to their east, they get the immense threat of Safavid Shia Iran. If the Ottomans had not faced that threat to their east, they would almost certainly have conquered most of Italy, Vienna, and would have been a much, much more serious threat to Christian Europe. So there's the geopolitics. Probably even more to the point is the fact that the Russians, and this is complicated, I'll talk about it in my next lecture, basically create their variant on the theme of the European military fiscal state, which is the most formidable military fiscal machine in the world in the 18th century, the European fiscal military state. The Ottomans failed to do so. Points to note is that at the heart of the Russian success are autocracy and serfdom, a particularly vicious and exploitative version of serfdom, and the westernization of the Russian elites. Catherine herself is a good symbol of that. Can you imagine the Ottoman Empire in the 18th century being ruled by a German woman? No, you can't. It's a symbol of westernization. I would just end by saying that in the longer run, I think it is fair to say that part of the political crisis, a considerable amount of it, which leads into the Russian Revolution, is precisely derived from memories of a highly exploitative, autocratic, serf-based system, plus the cultural conflict between westernized elite and non-westernized mass. So you pay a price for Russian victory in the long run. On the other hand, you pay a hell of a price for Ottoman defeat if you're a Muslim as well. The consequences of the decline and fall of the Ottoman Empire are the genocide in the real sense of the word, and/or more often vast-scale ethnic cleansing of most of the Muslim population of the northern and northeastern borderlands of the Russian Empire, millions and millions of people who flow back into Turkey. Beyond that, this is part of a broader picture in which the decline of the Ottoman Empire, which is the great champion of Islam, results in the colonization of part of the Islamic heartland, not least, of course, Jerusalem, Palestine, you name it, all at because of the victory of European imperial power, of which Russian imperial power is really one element. And I think if you're looking at the present crisis in the Middle East, you might say that it is to some extent still a post-Ottoman crisis, for reasons I won't go into now, but can talk about when I talk about Ukraine and post-empire. And I think if you look at the present world, if you're thinking of great civilizational blocks, the West, the Latin West, Hindu civilization in India, Confucian civilization in China, and Islam, those would really be the four greatest civilizational blocks I would think of for the last, God knows how many hundreds of years. And I think it's pretty self-evident that the Islamic bloc has the least reason to feel happy with itself. Persecuted by the Chinese in Xinjiang, hated by most of, sotto voce, by most of the Western tradition, of course, very much at the receiving end in terms of Modi's India. And in general, as I say, doing much less well than it had for the millennium between its foundation in the 7th century and the 17th century. So this talk about, talking about Russia moving southwards is part, of course in some senses a unique part, but also very much part of a bigger global geopolitical but also civilizational conflict. Good. That's it.
Wow, exactly. Excellent. Thank you so much. Tom.
Thank you so much. Impossible to follow Dominic, who's said many things which also cover what I want to say. I'm going to talk more about the Caucasus, but I kind of start with a proposition which is obvious, but I think is worth stating, that obviously there were, and we had this on day one, that there were different kinds of Russian imperialism in different geographies, and in the south you see that. You see, as Dominic has been talking about, Novorossiya, which is the northern coast of the Black Sea. That was the Catherine the Great project, displacing the Crimean Tatars and the Zaporizhia Cossacks from that northern shore of the Black Sea. That became an almost American-style project that, with the exception of Crimea, the rest of the land was the so-called wild field. Dikia Polya was quite sparsely populated, so it was almost an American-style colonization of those lands, and new cities springing up all across the northern shore of the Black Sea, such as Odessa, being founded in 1794, but was the fastest growing city of the 19th century, I think maybe only matched by Chicago, and became a free port, had a totally different economy and social structure from other cities, a French governor at the beginning of the 19th century. Jews were allowed to settle there and trade, as my ancestors, the Efrusis, did, were free of the restrictions of the Pale of Settlement, Greeks and Italians. So it was a kind of Enlightenment project under the Russian Empire, that northern shore of the Black Sea, all in the name of making Russia a trading empire to the south and to the world. Totally different story when it comes to the North Caucasus, and yet again, the Transcaucasus, or the South Caucasus, as we now call it, the Transcaucasus in the Russian projection. And I think that's worth exploring, that as far as the North Caucasus was concerned, these were Muslim peoples who had no rights at all. There was no question of making them Russian citizens in the first instance, with a few exceptions, the Ossetians being one because they were Christian. They held the geographically important position at the bridgehead, Vladikavkaz, across to Georgia. But as Dominic has said, we basically saw genocide, to use a retrospective term, in the 19th century. And the longest war, probably of the 19th century, was the war Russia fought in the North Caucasus, starting around 1800, ending only in 1864, and ending with the mass deportation of the people we call the Circassians or the Cherkess, more than 1 million of them being deported across to the Ottoman Empire, and most of them, at least half of them probably dying in the process. And there's small peoples in the North Caucasus who've never recovered from that. There's the last speaker of the Ubykh language died in Turkey about 20 or 30 years ago, and that it was a perfectly substantial people in the 19th century. You read the words of Russian generals about the Chechens, and it's all the language of extermination. Grozny means, as you know, means fearful. It was deliberately called Grozny to intimidate the natives. That it was made as a fortress. So in imperial terms, we're talking more about what the British or the Belgians did in parts of Africa than really that would be the comparison. But yet, long before the North Caucasus was defeated and incorporated, the Transcaucasus also became part of the Russian Empire. So further, extended geographical space, but integrated sooner. And here we see many reasons, and Ron is sitting here, and Ron should be giving this presentation, given the number of histories he's had. He's written of the South Caucasus. But we're talking much more about the British in India here. We're talking about smaller numbers of Russians, smaller garrisons, and basically co-optation of elites. The Georgian aristocracy, who, because of their aristocratic feudal structure, could be sort of shoehorned into the Russian aristocracy. The Georgian church, had its many of its autonomous functions taken away, but was still allowed to function. And the Armenians, a different picture. But in both cases, these were identified as kind of little brothers, junior Christian nations who, for religious reasons, were glad to leave the domination of either the Ottomans or the Persians, which they had been for the last 200 years, and join the Russian Empire. The Georgians did this not very willingly, but in 1795, Tiflis, or Tbilisi as it now is, was completely devastated by the Persian army. It took 30 years to rebuild. And in that context, it's no surprise that a few years later, the Georgians were signing a treaty with the Russians as a lesser of two evils, to join a Christian empire where they had at least some, not full rights, but some rights at all to exist. Azerbaijan is an interesting case because treated differently from the peoples of the North Caucasus. They also had, being basically a Shia Persian Khanate, they also had a feudal structure which could also be accommodated into the Russian Empire. So that meant in all of those cases, all of those peoples of the Transcaucasus had some kind of social mobility. They were not completely suppressed. So it was a form of colonial rule, but more, as I say, the way that the British, co-opted native elites in India. And there are very pragmatic reasons why you want this territory, and then it becomes more valuable at the end of the 19th century, principally because you want it because of its Black Sea ports, for it's the route south to the Middle East, and then in the end of the 19th century, Baku oil becomes that you suddenly possess the most critical new commodity in the modern world in Baku. But you're never fully in control. There are periodic rebellions. There's huge complexity. No one's going to learn all the languages of the Caucasus apart from one or two nerdy officers. How many British officers learned all the languages of India? Probably 5 or 10 polymaths, and that was about it. With the Caucasus, I'm always reminded, Charles de Gaulle was said to have once said, how is it possible to govern a country, France, which has 246 types of cheese? Well, how would you govern a country called Georgia, which has at least 246 brands of wine? It's the same sort of complexity. It's more of an impersonation of control a lot of the time than it is full control. So that's much more to say about that, but that would be my kind of take on the different types of Russian rule in the south. And just to say a bit about, and I think this point is not fully appreciated when people talk about the continuities in Russian power, and they include the Soviet Union there. And that does not really map very well onto the South Caucasus because, of course, the Soviet Union had many contradictions. It was both anti-imperialist and imperialist at the same time. And, in different periods, it was more one and more the other. But for sure, the Bolshevik project, which obviously set the template at the beginning of the Soviet Union, was more anti-imperialist. And the whole difficult, complex ethno-territorial structure on the one hand, all these different autonomies, was basically a Bolshevik policy to try and control the South Caucasus and contain its many different ethno-national disputes and contradictions. There's a widespread, I think, misplaced stereotype that there was a kind of that the creation of these autonomies like Abkhazia and Nagorno-Karabakh was a deliberate planting of a time bomb, a divide and rule policy. But when you read the scholars who actually write about this, Arsen Saparov has written extensively about this. This was basically the opposite. This was an attempt to contain conflict in the belief that if we give these people autonomy, if we give them national structures, in 20 or 30 years we'll have built a new proletarian, socialist, non-national system. This is a temporary arrangement to get over the problems that we have now, which was caused by conquering this region in haste. And hey, in a generation or so, there'll all be Soviet socialist people and we'll forget. Of course, those temporary fixes, those temporary territorial arrangements persisted until the 1990s when they broke the South Caucasus, and I would argue broke the Soviet Union apart, because those fault lines remained. Those national entities remained, in a kind of frozen state and then re-erupted. But the other point about the South Caucasus is the number of cadres it supplied to the Soviet elite. How many Bolsheviks were Georgian? Not just Stalin, but many, many others, that one could name. That the Soviet Union, then under Stalin, became, the elite was packed with Georgians, with very mixed results for Georgia itself. I'm not saying that it did have some advantages for Georgia, but some disadvantages, and many Armenians as well, given the small size of Armenia. The number of Armenians who served in senior positions, like the Mikoyan brothers, one of whom was, the longest serving member of the Politburo, the other was the most famous Soviet engineer, designed the MiG aircraft. And Azerbaijan is much less so, but in the late Soviet period, the most influential figure from the South Caucasus in the 70s and 80s was Haydar Aliyev, also absolutely key member of the Politburo, who then made a smooth transition to become the president, well, with some interruptions, not so smooth, but made a transition to become the president of Azerbaijan. So the Soviet Union was many things. It was a Russifying project in many ways, but it was also an anti-imperialist, non-national project in others. And I think all those contradict. You can read the history of the South Caucasus and the Soviet era both ways and be correct. And any history of that has to deal with those contradictions. Look at, and this will be my final point, look at Edward Shevardnadze. I think all those contradictions are embodied in one person. Here was a Georgian from a poor family from Guria, just up the Black Sea coast from us, who, thanks to the Soviet system and its, amazing social mobility, was able to rise to the top of the elite. He was a loyal servant to Moscow, who once said that the sun rises in the north, made much obeisance to Moscow, but at the same time was incredibly clever at preserving Georgian cultural rights. There were these famous demonstrations in Tbilisi in 1978, which were on basically a symbolic issue, which was the removal from the new Georgian Soviet constitution of Georgian as the language of the Georgian Socialist Republic. It was really a point which actually didn't have much practical implementation, but for Georgians it was a huge blow to their prestige and national pride. And there were demonstrations in the streets of Tbilisi with Georgians holding up slogans with the famous first line of the Georgian linguistic primer, Ia, I am a violet, is that right? Which was, did I get that right, Zura? And then Shevardnadze, as he told me when I went to interview him in his dotage, I asked him about contemporary politics. He had nothing to say. I asked him about the 1990s. He had little to say, but he was really struggling. And like often when you talk to your grandfather, and he has much more to say about the distant past, suddenly when he was talking about the 1970s, he spoke with real clarity. He gave me everything he'd done. He knew that this change was coming. He'd gone to Moscow. He'd known that Suslov was the bad guy. He had to head him off. He talked to other members of the Politburo, such as Chernenko, and he warned them that this was going to happen, that there was going to be a problem, and he warned them that he might ask for concessions. And when the demonstrators came out, there were Soviet troops on standby, and Shevardnadze came out and spoke to the crowd, and he said, exceeding his authority, he said, I've spoken to Moscow, and I can give you my assurances that this change will not happen. Which Moscow they'd sort of said, but they hadn't fully said. But of course, once the troops were stood down, the local party leader had solved the situation, and Moscow said, oh, all right, okay, you got away with it this time, Edward. And interestingly, what the Armenians, it was already being removed from the constitution. The Armenians said, hey, what about us? Can we have our language back too? And they were given it too. So that's a classic case of Soviet South Caucasus. The Russians are sort of in control, but the local leader can manipulate mass and intelligentsia opinion. He builds up his own power base. And it's no surprise that in 1991, there are these nationalist groups which take over, Gamsakhodia and Elchebe, but they have no sustained policy to govern. It's an emotional reaction, and very soon, who takes over again? It's these old Soviet elites. It's Aliyev and Shevardnadze, who were quasi-national leaders in the Soviet period and re-emerge as full national leaders in the post-Soviet period. It's a bit of a scattergun little presentation, but I'll stop now.
Lots of ideas.
So I will talk about something very specific after these sweeping presentations before me. I will talk about, on the subject of Russia moving south, about a moment in Russian history when they moved really south and finally came to Constantinople. So you know that in the Russian imperial imagination, Constantinople always loomed large. It was the city to be replaced by Moscow first, and then the city to be captured from Peter onward. And they came close several times, never closer to actually putting a cross on Hagia Sophia and realizing what Dostoevsky, Tom quoted Dostoevsky the other day, who said, Constantinople has to be ours. Never closer than during World War I, when the Allies had an agreement in case of Allies' victory that Russia will take Constantinople. But then life happened. The revolution happened. Russia pulled out of the alliance, and Constantinople was occupied by the British and the French and the Italians. In that moment, the remnants of the Russian army and waves of refugees, Russian or former subjects of the Russian Tsar, finally came to Constantinople as defeated people, as people in search of refuge. This is one of the most poignant ironies in Russian history. after the defeat of Denikin's army here in the territories that we are presently together in, the several waves of ships across the Black Sea brought to the Bosphorus about, I mean, here the sources are not in agreement, but let's say at least 300,000 subjects, former subjects of the Russian Tsar, ended up in the Ottoman capital. The Ottoman capital, which was not Ottoman anymore, but was an occupied city. And here, there's an interesting encounter of the Ottomans and the Russians on the territory of the city of the Tsar, Tsargrad. They were both бывшие люди, they both were have-beens. And they met on a new ground in kind of shared sympathy toward one another in a very interesting dynamic that was established there. Because in a way, the Turks were also visitors in their own city. They were not hosts. There were no hosts, in a way, in Constantinople at the time. So these refugees who came, they were not a homogeneous mass. They were not all Russians. They were not, even though the Turks called them Beyaz Ruslar, white Russians, they were not all white politically. They represented the heterogeneity of the empire. And among them were representatives of the aristocratic elite, the cultural elite, but there were also people who came from other strata of society. They were not equally destitute. Most of them had left everything behind. Some managed to live with quite significant wealth. So they were not even equal there in Constantinople. But as a group, they were really refugees in need of basic support, who were mostly preoccupied with their survival. They didn't come to Constantinople to stay. And that makes this moment very different than other hubs, other centers of Russian immigration westward, like Paris, Berlin, New York. They initially came for a temporary respite with the hope of going back when things change. And since nothing changed for the better in Russia, then they stayed only temporarily in waiting for transit visas. So in a way, Constantinople was the Russian Casablanca of the post-World War I, a waiting space. And they thought of this stay in the city as an empty time. And yet it proved really transformative for them, because this was the moment when the former subjects of the Russian Empire had to reimagine, once they gave away the hope for returning and the hope for restoring the empire, they had to reimagine themselves as citizens of the world, to create new identities for themselves. And this is a painful process, which required a lot of creativity. And while they were doing that, they managed to leave indelible traces on the face of the city that hosted them. And this is a story which is very rarely told, but it's very interesting how this first wave of Russian immigrants after the Civil War managed to transform life in the capital of their arch enemies, the Ottomans. And I will be very brief, just sketching some of the results of this state. It's a much longer, much more complex story. But one of the very first things that we can say about this, what I call the Russian moment in Constantinople's history, a brief moment, by the way, which lasted between 1919, when the first wave of refugees came to the city, and 23, when most of them left in the direction of Western Europe. Mostly some of them were pushed back to Bolshevik Russia. But the Turks, once the Kemalist Republic was established, didn't want the Russian refugees there. So during that time, this massive army of Russophone speakers in the Bosphorus began to transform urban life in the city. They settled mostly in the Pera region of the city, and some of them in the islands, the islands in the Sea of Marmara. In Pera, the western part of Istanbul, where all the Western European consulates were situated, they opened an explosion of entertainment establishments where some revolutionary things happened. Gender commingling was allowed. There were female waitresses. There were dancing floors. Men and women could dance together. This is still the end days of the Ottoman Empire, where the segregation of the sexes was very strict, where Russian cuisine was introduced together with Russian vodka. By the way, Smirnoff vodka was branded in Istanbul, and where a lot of different kinds of performative arts took place in an improvisational form. Performative arts were the name of the game for the Russians in Constantinople, because they worked across language barriers. So pantomime, dance, especially Western-style ballet, which was introduced by the Russians in Constantinople for the first time. Some various other kinds of dances, and music from classical music all the way to jazz. Vernon Duke, so known in the West, but whose real name was Vladimir Dukelsky, began his jazz experiments and first jazz publications in Constantinople. And visual art, which was a no-no for in the Ottoman Empire, aniconic Islam. They didn't allow representations of any kind of human figures. Portraiture flourished. There were several Russian artists who found themselves in Constantinople who were very successful in painting not just the elite of the occupying army personnel during the armistice, but in some Turkish representatives of the Turkish elite. The Ukrainian modernist painter Alexei Grishenko was in the city for about 2 years. He will become then very famous in Paris. And being destitute, and he didn't have any money for paints or canvases, he did a series of amazing watercolors painting the city and the swirling dervishes and Byzantine monuments, for the first time revealing to the emerging Turkish painterly elite the treasures, the visual treasures of their own city that taught them how to see their city through the eyes of a modern painter rather than blindly imitating German modernism as they were taught to. Such stars of Turkish modernism as Namık Ismail, who was a close friend of Grishenko during this period, were actually rearranged their imagination as a result of this cultural encounter. And of course, Byzantine studies became possible, and the restoration of Byzantine monuments in the city became possible because of Russian scholars who ended up there for a short period of time and helped, among other things, restore the frescoes of Hagia Sophia. Talking about urban life, I should mention 2 other things. The Russians opened the eyes of the Istanbul about their beaches and introduced beach culture to Istanbul, which was both fascinating and scandalous because semi-naked women were walking along the shores of the Bosphorus to the sheer amazement of Turkish men. And the other thing that Russian women introduced to the city was Western-style fashion. Short hair, cuts, which, by the way, were necessitated for hygienic reasons. There was an epidemic of lice in the city, so women cut their head on this kalakol, the style of the 20s. That became super fashionable in Istanbul. Not just the hairdos, but the hemlines of the dresses and the fur. So ateliers for female fashion and fur shops were introduced in the city, changing the way former Ottoman women thought about beauty and about their own clothes. And so if I have to sum up this brief but important moment about the Russo-Turkish encounters and the Russian move south is based on paradoxes. The Russians came to the city not as victors but as refugees. They thought of this time as empty, but it turned out to be transformative both for guests and hosts. And the most unexpected thing is the Russian men had tried to conquer Constantinople with weapons for centuries. But if Constantinople was ever conquered by Russians, it was by the Russian women. And the whole city called the Russians хорошо, but that was mostly a compliment for the dangerous charms of the Russian women. So I will leave you at that.
So, well, it's an eclectic bunch of stories. You'll have lots of questions. And I'm going to talk a little bit about one of my favorite topics, which is how the Soviet Union was made. Actually, how it was put together during World War I. Dominic yesterday talked about the Great War as this incredibly transformative or formative moment, right? One world ends and another begins. So the world of the Gilded Age and of the long peace, the long 19th century is gone, and we now are entering an age in which there'll be communism, fascism, violence beyond description. And in my reading, I want to first argue that that much of Soviet history that we learned conventionally, or certainly that's perpetrated and propagandized in some ways in the West, is largely wrong, or at least very, very much ideologically formed, because the Soviet Union was our major enemy during the Cold War. And so much of Soviet history, and even of our profession, Sovietologists or Soviet historians, was about indicting the Soviet Union, showing all the negativities, all the pathologies, but not explaining what they would have called достижения, achievements. So it was always on both sides of this kind of ideological formation. And within the middle of it, there were people like Sheila Fitzpatrick and I'd say Moshe Levine and other really good historians who tried to sort of look at the Soviet history in some much more complicated way. Now, if we look at the years of the formation of the Soviet Union, one of the major texts was by a right-wing conservative historian, Richard Pipes, who taught at a prestigious university called Harvard.
For which we now have to feel very sorry.
Yeah, and Richard Pipes, in fact, wrote a book called The Formation of the Soviet Union. And the argument of that book was, and the chapter titles were thus entitled, the chapter titles were The Conquest of the Caucasus, The Conquest of Ukraine, The Conquest of Central Asia, etc., right? So you have an image of an empire expanding through military might and imposing, because after all, in his view, nationalism was natural and was the real aspiration of people, and socialism and empire were artificial and imposed. So that was a powerful image, and it worked well during the Cold Wars. And indeed, I would say in many ways, this is one of Pipes' best books, and it's worth reading because there's a lot of valuable information. But it's highly, in one sense, ideological. Now, actually, the Soviet Union was formed with the collapse of one empire and the building, as Tom mentioned, of another kind of empire, the Soviet Empire, which I would gladly call an empire for reasons we can discuss. And it occurred during wartime. So this wasn't a peaceful transition. This was during the greatest war that Europe or the world had faced up to that time, World War I, and continued after the war for another couple of years in civil war. And civil war is the most vicious kind of war. Okay, the trench warfare was horrific, but civil war is, brother, sister against each other, and it involves terror, all kinds of horrors because it's a fight over sovereignty. Who's going to emerge and become the sovereign power? Is it going to be the whites? Is it going to be the reds? Is it going to be nationalists here or there or whatever? And in that context, if you take a civil war context, then you have to figure that a lot of things are going on simultaneously. The Bolsheviks have ambitions. They want to build a big state, a new state. They want to create a new world. They want to not necessarily just stop with the state, but create a revolution that will spread throughout the world, right? They have incredible fantasies about changing the nature of history. And various peoples in various peripheries of the empire also have their interests in creating smaller states or national nation states or whatever. But mixed into this complexity is a combination of what you can call social forces determining things, as well as political impositions by elites. So, in other words, there's a complex contest. It's not just Russia against the periphery, but there are in the peripheries socialists, anarchists, peasant movements, all kinds of things operating together. And you have to take some notice of this complexity. But that's not all. there's also foreign forces, because revolutions are often followed by interventions. And in this case, in the case of World War I, the Germans had, and Dominic talked about this yesterday, their own imperial vision, which was not quite Hitler in terms of the racist sense, but was about building an empire and a kind of hegemony over much of Eastern Central Europe and parts of Russia, right? I don't think they talked necessarily in terms of Lebensraum, but they were going to make satellites. And so when Germans move east, I won't go through this in a lot of detail, they support anti-Bolshevik, anti-Soviet national forces. In some ways, the creation of Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Ukraine is a German invention. They support the local nationalists, who are very small. Nationalism does not naturally arise from the bottom up, from people. It is largely created by nationalist activists, intellectuals, journalists, teachers, etc., and spreads down. In other words, nationalism is not natural. It's not a matter of the blood. It's a human creation in competition with other human creations, which could be civic identities, class identities, or whatever. And this is the complexity of the way you can see this. And you can see it in different parts of what will become the Soviet Union today. Parenthetically, just stepping back for a moment, I want to say, when you look at histories and you see the way they're written and how a narrative is created, as historians or good political scientists or any social scientist, what you should also look for is what has been left out. What has been left out? Now, in his conquest theory, or narrative, Pipes left out Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Finland, all of which had been part of the Russian Empire, but would not be part of the new Soviet Union. If they had been included, you would have found a different kind of story. For instance, that Lenin recognized the independence of those countries. From the beginning, Poland and Finland, and eventually the Baltic states as well. What about Georgia? It's very interesting. Georgia was the one place, well, Finland too to some extent, but was a place where the national liberation movement, highly powerful and popular, overwhelmingly dominating all other parties, the national liberation movement was Marxist. It was a socialist movement made up of these so-called Georgian Mensheviks, right? Noya Jordani at the head, a lot of other very prominent figures. And they had overwhelming support when they declared Georgia an independent state. And they had the ability, and to some extent, largely a success, of building a bourgeois democratic state. I say bourgeois democratic because they were realistic enough to, as Marxists, to realize you could not build socialism yet, right? Like the Mensheviks in Russia as well, we were still in the period of bourgeois democracy. The socialist revolution would need further development, consciousness of the working class, etc. And they successfully built relatively democratic state. I say relatively because certain areas had also to be conquered militarily. Oh, interesting. South Ossetia was one, which was largely Bolshevik. Some things go back. Abkhazia was another. And there was a war with Armenia, a little war over Lori. You're going to go through Lori on the way from Yerevan to Tbilisi. So there was also secret police, and we got to get rid of the Bolsheviks, so we repressed the Bolsheviks. We get rid of the soldiers, the Russian soldiers who were here, but they managed to form this thing. So now you have a viable or very fragile little Bauernrepublik, as Kautsky called it when he came to visit. That's a peasant republic. And Lenin was ready to make a treaty, and made a treaty with Georgia to recognize the Georgian government, because it's a socialist government. Okay, they're Mensheviks, they're not quite Bolsheviks. But there were a couple of Georgians around. One was Djugashvili Stalin, and the other was Ordzhonikidze, Sergo Ordzhonikidze. And they were determined to make Georgia a Soviet republic. And so I won't go into all the details. It's fascinating how it happened. But eventually the Red Army invaded, It went, as Tom showed yesterday, into first Azerbaijan. That was easy because the working class in Baku was very powerful. The republic was quite weak, was dependent on the Turks. They had largely left. And then into Armenia. Armenia sort of gave in, even signed up with the Bolsheviks. Why? Because Turks are coming from the south. And that's more dangerous than the Bolsheviks. And then they came up and they took Tbilisi. Once that fait accompli of conquering and creating Soviet Georgia, my father was in Tbilisi at the time. He remembers the Bolsheviks coming in. He remembers them singing the international, Stavaj, and we won't go into that. I'm not a great singer. Anyway, and he remembers gathering up the weapons of the Mensheviks and burying them in the backyard of their little house, so their apartment. And they took over. And of course, then Lenin, being very pragmatic, the most pragmatic of all Bolsheviks, he immediately recognized that there was now a Soviet republic and so on. So there's a number of different kinds of stories in these various events. Now, civil war, and I'm going to end with this, is never actually accomplished simply by winning on the battlefield. It's also about winning the hearts and minds. So there's a lot of propaganda that goes on. But there's also terror. And Bolsheviks, following the Jacobins and even admiring the Jacobins, who of course were bourgeois revolutionaries, nevertheless, they actually believed in terror. They believed you had to use terror as a weapon. And Lenin made declarations over and over again. Hang all these enemies from the highest trees so everyone can see you, etc. In other words, revolutions are made not by winning elections. It's not a election campaign. It's war. Revolutions are wars, and they're made and won largely by men with guns, men largely, with guns in the right place at the right time. That's how they took over in October in Petrograd. That's how they won the Civil War. But here's a little fact, and I'll end with that is not as well known in the historiography. Is terror was used by both sides, of course, by whites and by reds. And which side used terror the most? Who killed the most people? The whites. And it's not hard to imagine why it was the whites, because the whites were largely heavily anti-Semitic, and they had pogroms against the Jews. So in numbers, about 10% of Jews were actually killed by the Red Army or by loose affiliated groups, and there's a very good book on that. But very quickly, Moscow disciplined, said, this is not our show, we don't do that. And Jews, of course, then flocked, not accidentally, from whatever they were, neutral or Zionist or moderate or whatever, to the Bolsheviks. And there was a kind of alliance between Russian and Ukrainian Jewry and the Bolsheviks. And the whites largely were the ones who, and I have a wonderful quote here, but hopefully I won't find it, because if I find it, it's a little too bloody. It's about treating Bolsheviks when you capture them like geese, slitting their throats and destroying them. So this was a disastrous, horrible event. Eventually, the Bolsheviks came out on top in most places, and then very quickly, Lenin changed his policy, put down terror, created what he called the new economic policy. We'll talk about that. Made concessions both to the peasants and to the non-Russian peoples in a policy called korenizatsiya, or indigenization, and that's another topic for another time. So now we'll open it up for our discussion. It's yours.